Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack.
Today we bring back historian and author Dr. Richard Ross III, author of Before Salem, Witch Hunting in the Connecticut River Valley 1647 to 1663.
We have changed up our format today, and Dr. Ross opens by presenting a story you probably haven't heard.
Then we have a great discussion.
This is a 19th century newspaper witchcraft story that intersects with abolition themes such as the Amistad court case.
In this discussion, we cover Southern newspapers using witch trials against New England abolitionists.
Welcome back to the podcast, author Richard Ross III. We're really happy to have you back today to hear about this research. Tell us about your work and expertise.
Okay, thank you. I'll give you some background. First of all, I have a PhD from Boston College in German history and a master's degree and an MLS. And I have taught in various colleges and universities in New England and have also held library administrative positions. One of my last two positions, my admin level position, was at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And then I became the college librarian at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. While I was at Trinity College, I taught a seminar for over 10 years on witch trials in New England. And I retired from Trinity College as Professor Emeritus. I'm the author of 3 books. The first one is called Contagion and Pressure, 1831, The Cholera Epidemic and the Threat of the Polish Uprising. The second book is Before Salem, Witch Hunting in the Connecticut River Valley, 1647 to 1663, which most of my work is based on that for the presentations that I'm giving. And last year, I published American Body Snatchers, Merchandising the Dead in 19th Century New England and Washington, D.C., and that was published, as I said, last year. And I've given presentations and talks to libraries, to historical societies, and to museums, particularly. And also I have various talks available on YouTube. And so what I'd like to do now is to begin to talk about this, the witch in old Connecticut writing a troubled legacy. And one of the issues, the problem with witch trials in Connecticut is that nobody really had known anything about these witch trials. There was very little information available. And I have here in 1800, Benjamin Trumbull, a historian, Connecticut historian, wrote, "It may possibly be thought a great neglect or matter of partiality that no account is given of witchcraft in Connecticut." And he concluded that the only reason is that after the most careful researches, no indictment of any person for that crime nor any process relative to that affair can be found. And that was his conclusion. John M. Taylor, who wrote the definitive book on the witchcraft in Connecticut in around 1908, I think, his Witchcraft Delusion in Colonial Connecticut, 1647 to 1697, he quoted the editor of John Winthrop's, it's not a diary, it was something else. "Perhaps there was sense enough early in the colony to destroy the record." So you have two approaches. One is that they were simply, it was legend, there were no witch trials, or there had been witch trials and the documentation was destroyed. And we have an early letter to the editor in the Hartford Times on October 5th, 1819. And this letter sort of came out of the blue. The person that wrote it questions the pious forefathers of New England, and he presents a questionable case of a family named Godfrey put to death for witchcraft in Stratford, Connecticut, and a later case in 1696 of a witch burnt in Hartford. Well, no witches were burnt, of course, and the case just didn't exist. There's no record of this anywhere. So people just ignored it. Now we come to the missing documents. Many Connecticut documents were held by the Willis family in their mansion built in 1638, including the ones concerning witchcraft. So they held all documents, early documents, in their home, and this was common practice. There was no place else to put them. 2 descendants, the Willises from way back in 1638, were Hezekiah and a brother, George Willis. And the latter was the last one to live in the mansion. And they allowed a Mr. William Leete Stone the editor of the Connecticut Mirror, to examine these papers. Now, this is kind of interesting because usually when you talk about this, they talk about William Stone. And nobody had, as far as I know, no one had actually said, well, what's the L stand for? Well, the L stand, as I said, for lead. And so there's a reason for this, and I'll explain why it's important. So Stone made copies of some of the papers and published them. They were picked up in various papers in July and August of 1820. He was himself a real character. So William Leete Stone was actually the descendant of the deputy governor of the Connecticut colony, William Leete, who served as the magistrate on the Harrison witchcraft trial. And it was a famous trial because Catherine Harrison had been tried in 1669, and there was no verdict as a result of this trial. I'm not going to go into the details here because I go on forever. She was retried on October 12, 1669, and the outcome here was guilty. She was reprieved due to a famous report of the ministers, which Governor John Winthrop Jr. had asked the ministers to look in. So what is proof? And they had determined that proof of witchcraft required two witnesses witnessing the same witchcraft activity. So on May 20th, 1670, the guilty verdict was not accepted by the court, and William Leete actually presided over that court. He was a deputy governor, as I said. He actually had been formerly the governor of the New Haven colony. And when they merged, when they were forced to merge, William Leete became an office holder in Connecticut colony. Samuel Willis also served as a magistrate in this trial. So the outcome was Catherine was ordered to remove herself from Wethersfield. So his family was aware that some trials had happened. I mean, he was probably the great-grandson or the grandson of William Leete. He was also, as I said, a character. So here I have a picture from the Connecticut Gazette on August 9th, 1820, and it was called The Olden Time Trials of the Witches. And what William Stone had been able to do was to get some of the records, some of the documents, and actually get them reviewed and put in his newspapers. And so we have an example of this here, and I think this one is the case of Mercy Disborough, who was tried as a witch. The documents primarily concern the later trials in 1692 of Mercy Disborough, Goodwife Clausen, Goody Miller, and Mrs. Staples. These people were, Mrs. Staples particularly, were kind of famous, to me anyway. Only Mercy Disborough was convicted of familiarity with the devil, and she was later acquitted on a legal technicality. At least what William Leete Stone was trying to do was to show that there was some documentation. The thing is, none of these people were executed, which is a positive thing, which is a good thing. So we don't get that sense of the hysteria that we will see in Salem later. This painting is said to represent the first Willis mansion, which was torn down sometime between 1827 and 1834, and this is the building the documents were stored in. The Connecticut colonial witchcraft documents, which I'm going to talk about exactly what happened to them and why nobody knew about these witch trials, etc. I'm going to explain this. The documents went to Colonel Hezekiah Willis's daughter, Amelia Willis Adams, on his death, and presumably to her residence in Charlestown, Massachusetts, where they remained in the family. In other words, they left Connecticut and they were now in a private collection, a private home. And so nobody knew about them and nobody knew where to go and get them and look at them. A portion of these documents was sold in 1868 to Nicholas Brown of Providence, Rhode Island, and remained in private hands until they were actually deposited at Brown University in 1948 by her husband after she passed away. So the documents never saw the light of day, these documents, until 1948. And so they just disappeared until then. The remaining portion passed eventually to John Carter Brown, and in July 1907, his widow, Sophia, sold some of the papers to George Goddard, the Connecticut State Librarian. So basically, we don't get the documents available for people to peruse and study until the 20th century. So they all disappeared. That's where they were. I want to point out that this Mr. R.G. Tomlinson, who is a genealogist, I believe, here in Connecticut, traced these documents in his book called Witchcraft Prosecution, Chasing the Devil in Connecticut. And I want to give him credit for that because I think it was a great job. What I want to move to next and just talk about briefly a little bit is, as a result of the fact that these documents weren't available, it's kind of like nature abhors a vacuum. And people, at least some people apparently, were able to use the fact that there was no factual documentation around as we get into the 19th century to sort of make things up. And so I'm going to talk about probably the most famous witch in Connecticut, Juliana Cox, who probably nobody's heard of now, and the story about how she became famous, why she became famous, and how this happened. Because as far as I can tell, nobody has written about this. So this will be kind of interesting, I think, to some people anyway, because it involves slavery. And this is the 19th century. And so I'm going to talk about this. So I have why a Connecticut witch trial and hanging was published in a Southern newspaper to embarrass the abolitionists in Connecticut. And I'll explain why. Without the documentation in Connecticut of the witch trials, the pro-slavists could fill in and use the witch metaphor as they pleased. The action had not been necessary during most of the 1830s, as Connecticut abolitionists had not been seen as a threat. The Connecticut legislature had actually passed an anti-black education law in 1834, as well as the fact that Prudence Crandall, who was a Quaker, had not been allowed to educate black girls in her school. They had rioted against this. They actually took her to court. And so the abolitionists they didn't have much to go on. They weren't very successful here in Connecticut. So these were major setbacks for the Connecticut abolitionists. So now we talk a little bit about the Salem legacy. So pro-slavery advocates painted abolitionists as religious zealots driven by emotion and a dangerous, irrational ideology similar to the accusers in Salem who are consumed by fear and faith. The abolitionist movement, much like the Salem court, disregarded the truth and due process, relying on spectral evidence or hearsay. This is what the pro-Southerners are saying, pro-slavery Southerners. In this case, perceived Northern bias to condemn the South's peculiar institution. An abolitionist effort similarly threatened the social structure and the stability of the Union, which would eventually lead to the anarchy or the Civil War. So this is the Salem legacy that the pro-Southern slavers were talking about, this irrational fanaticism which they perceived in the abolitionists. So-called religious fanaticism of the Massachusetts Puritans and the abolitionists versus the Southern slaveholders. And here's a little picture I have of that. And here, of course, they're burning the witches, which they didn't do. They didn't burn witches, they hanged them. So now we come to the revolt on the slave ship La Amistad in 1839. It's a very famous slave ship revolt. Connecticut is very famous for being involved in this, and I'll explain now. So the revolt began in 1839 after Joseph Sankey unshackled himself and the others on a slave ship and took control of the ship. The ship was ordered to set sail for Africa. Instead, the ship sailed north to the east coast of the United States, and the ship was seized off Long Island by an American patrol ship. The slaves were incarcerated in New Haven, Connecticut. There's more to this, of course. I'm giving you the brief outline. Incarcerated in New Haven, Connecticut on charges of murder because some people had been killed and piracy. The Amistad was towed to New London, Connecticut, and those remaining on board were arrested. And this is a picture of the Amistad. And the Connecticut abolitionists decided to take on the Amistad case to reinvigorate their movement. The case went to court in Connecticut and finally made its way up to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court determined that the Africans who mutinied on the Spanish slave ship La Amistad were free individuals, not property, because they were illegally kidnapped from Africa in violation of Spanish and anti-slave trade laws, and thus should be returned to their homeland, not treated as slaves or property. As a result of this, the Connecticut abolitionists gained momentum and a new credibility. The success of the Amistad trial in 1841 gave new momentum to the abolitionist movement and gave a newfound credibility to the Connecticut abolitionists. For the next 20 years, this case would continue to inspire the movement up to the Civil War. However, it was seen as a significant defeat by the pro-slave South. And now we come to Juliana Cox, the Connecticut witch. And here I have a picture of, this is the earliest record I can find of this particular case. And it occurred in a Maryland newspaper, the Port Tobacco Times, on April 6th, 1848. And it's a trial and a conviction of a Connecticut witch. And you can see from here, and I like this, in the beautiful town of Glastonbury in Connecticut, the following remarkable events occurred in 1753. And the story goes on, and I'll talk about it. So first I'm going to talk about the Port Tobacco Times and Charles County Advertiser, which was the name of it. The Port Tobacco Times was established in 1844 to supply the residents of Charles County, Maryland, with a weekly newspaper that supported the Democratic Party. Southern Maryland's residents were decidedly pro-Confederate in their sympathies, and the newspaper reflected this view. The entire Maryland actually remained loyal to the Union, but there were areas that were sympathetic to the South, the slaveholders. So this is the case. This is the way the story went. Juliana Cox, 44, was brought to trial for the capital offense of being a witch. A committee of 3 selectmen was appointed to examine her for witch marks. She was stripped and examined with tears and sobs. After being pricked in many places, she confessed to the 2 marks. The committee reported to the court conclusive proof. Miss Cox was convicted of witchcraft and sentenced to be hanged on April 7, 1753. While awaiting her sentence, it was said that strange noises and demons haunted the Hartford prison. There should have been a lot of tip-offs here, by the way, but a large crowd was there to attend her execution. She claimed she was innocent and admitted to the witch marks they found to stop the pricking, the little devices for pricking. Everyone believed she was in league with the devil. She claimed the hunter came upon her in the woods and tried to have his way with her. She refused, and he set his dogs upon her. He feared he would be accused of rape and set this charge of witchcraft on her. This she said under the gallows. Following Juliana's trial, as she stood on the gallows, the people said, now this is where we get this business of irrational fanaticism. And this is put in there on purpose, I'm sure. Burn the witch. Hanging was too easy for so foul a strumpet of the devil. When the people went to get the wood, the sheriff hanged her. She died on the gallows before the wood could be brought to burn her. Her place of execution was Gallows Hill in Hartford. So we know Gallows Hill was never used to hang witches on, but this is in the story. It was reported as a news story. It was a response to the successful outcome of the Amistad trial. It was an attempt to get as far as I can tell, it illustrated that the abolitionists in Connecticut were also the enemy of the Southern slaveholders and were prone to fanaticism like their ancestors and just as guilty of embracing the religious fanaticism like the ones in Massachusetts and the neighbors who perpetrated the witch trials in Salem. And here's where we get to the point of where was the story inspired from. Seducimus Triumphatus, or full and plain evidence concerning witches and apparitions. In the first edition, 1681, this was a book published in England, and we have the trial of Juliana Cox, not Juliana, Juliana Cox of Taunton. Taunton is in a county, the same county, by the way, as Glastonbury. And this is just a picture of Juliana Cox and a man sitting smoking by the hearth, and a toad is by the feet of the man. It's a little illustration there. And this tells the story. And here's the opening text compared. An huntsman who swore that he went out with a pack of hounds to hunt a hare. The dogs hunted close. The hare, almost spent, ran to the side to take it up. As soon as he laid hands on the hare, he perceived it proved to be Juliana Cox, who had her head groveling on the ground. She was so out of breath that she could not make him an answer. This is the opening of the Juliana Cox, the one in America. A hunter went out with his dogs to hunt and discovered an old gray fox. His dogs gave chase. When he came near the fox, he heard a strange noise, and on the other side of the hole, he found Juliana Cox lying there, panting and out of breath. So clearly, the opening's the same. It was, taken from that story, some of it. And here we have, and this is kind of important, this story was played out in newspapers all over the United States, multiple newspapers. I've seen them. I've gone and searched them out. And it's pretty much the same story. And finally, it ended up being published in some of the most, this is after the Civil War even. This is even after the Civil War, they're still going on with the story. And here's a picture of what happened. They have an illustration here. And some of the more popular news magazines in the United States. And one of them was Frank Leslie's Popular Monthly. Another one was an American magazine. It was called something like that. So the story was perpetrated by a pro-slave Southerner to embarrass the Connecticut abolitionists for their success with the Amistad trial. There are multiple reasons why this story is entirely false. I'm not going to go into every one of them, but I've talked a little bit about it. As a matter of fact, just as a quick example, the witchcraft law was repealed in Great Britain in 1735, and they're talking 1753, and we would have been under the English law in 1753. So get that there. And there's a lot of material in the story that's just simply incorrect. But what's interesting about it is that, as I said, it was repeatedly printed in the nation's newspapers. And I said even as late as 1881, was reprinted in Frank Leslie's Sunday Magazine in 1879, Frank Leslie's Popular Monthly in 1881, and the American Illustrated Magazine in 1881, all with an illustration to accompany the article. It should be noted, to give the article some credibility, the author wrote it was from the Hartford Times, published in 1823, and was based on an abridged statement of Dinah Jones before a committee of the delegates to review the laws of Connecticut. I actually went back and looked at the Hartford Times for 1823 and the years surrounding it to say, was there any kind of story like this? Where did they get this from? And obviously there is nothing in the newspaper regarding this story. And so as I searched further, I've actually found out that this was all made up, and I found out where the story came from, etc. I would just like to say, too, that people may not know this, but slavery was not abolished in Connecticut until 1848, the same year this article was published. So the turnaround. So after the Civil War, there was some controversy over who was the first woman actually executed as a witch in Connecticut. Many people thought it was Mary Johnson. In the 1880s, Mary Johnson of Wethersfield, it was argued by some, was from Windsor and was the first woman executed for witchcraft in 1648. But records indicated that she was from Wethersfield, and a particular court earlier had named her for thievery, and that she was from Wethersfield, so it wasn't her. Now, we have this fellow, James Hammond Trumbull, pretty famous in his time. He was a historian. He held a lot of positions in the state of Connecticut. He happened to have in his possession a diary, Matthew Grant's diary. He was the second town clerk of Windsor, Connecticut. And for a number of years, he had information which he did not share, and it was very important information. And he just did not share it with the public. And we don't know why. He just didn't do it. And we call it Grant's diary. And contained in the following flyleaf, I'll show you in a second, we see May 26, 1647, Alice Young was hanged. So we know now that a woman named Alice Young was the first woman hanged as a witch in Connecticut. Things are beginning to come out now. We're beginning to see that there were witch trials and people were executed. And it wasn't just all legend. In December 1547, we have one John Newbury was hanged. And we know he wasn't hanged as a witch. He was hanged for something else. What was it? I forget now. Anyway, on March 19th, 1650, we have Carrington and his wife were hanged. And they were hanged as witches because we have a record of them. So here's a copy of the picture from Matthew Grant's diary. And if you look at it closer, you can see what I had written on the previous slide. So when do we finally get a little more information? When does it become public? Well, in 1904, Annie E. Trumbull, James Trumbull's daughter, published an article called One Blank of Windsor in the Hartford Courant on December 3rd, 1904. This was a reference from John Winthrop's journal, One of Windsor, arraigned and executed at Hartford for a witch. But John Winthrop never put the woman's name in. So for years, we have known about something like this, but there was no official record. We didn't know who it was. If that person was actually executed, who knows? So now we actually have some proof because we had Grant's diary and we look back at John Winthrop's mention in his journal. This established the first accused witch hanged in New England was Alice Young of Windsor. And it was published in an important newspaper and thus was disseminated to a much wider audience. In other words, now the public knew. Possibly previously, the only people that knew this were maybe the genealogists and a few historians. And this is a picture of Annie Elliott Trumbull. And as I noted earlier, in 1868, most of the colonial documents were sold to Nicholas Brown in Providence. Today, they are housed in the John Hay Library at Brown University. The other portion of the documents that went to his grandson, John Carter Brown, were sold by his widow in July 1907, of course, to the Connecticut State Librarian, and they're currently housed in the Connecticut State Library. The latter were the documents consulted by Taylor for his book, The Witchcraft Illusion in Colonial Connecticut, published in 1908. The witchcraft documents have been duplicated, and both libraries now provide access to both sets of documents. A consensus review of Taylor's book when it came out in 1908 was that the witchcraft illusion in Connecticut was quite as marked and atrocious as that in Massachusetts, but for some reason it escaped the notoriety which attaches to the misdoings of the Puritans. Well, the reason was because there were no documents available. Nobody knew where they were, as I said. Do you have any questions?
I have a number of questions about all of it. But to start off, I want to just clarify, were all of the Connecticut witch trial records believed to have been in that Willis papers at one point, or could there have been other records located somewhere else?
All the records that we know of that we have access to today, right, were in that collection. All the official records that we use.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other references throughout. You find references here and there, but these are they're depositions, most of them. They're not official trial records, although there's some idea that maybe there might be some, and I didn't deal with these records, but the ones from the 1692, around the time of the Salem witch trials in Fairfield, Connecticut,
Yeah.
there may be some of those may actually be from the trials, but generally speaking, most of the time they're depositions.
That was very interesting and helpful. Why do you think the story and the myth of Juliana Cox is so unknown?
I think one of the problems is that it probably, for a lot of people, just making that connection between criticizing the abolitionists is relatively, I'm not going to say it's new, but most of the, because people are familiar with this when it comes to Massachusetts, but not to Connecticut. But if you link it with the success of the Amistad trial, which really put the pro-slavery Southerners on their back heel, you can see why somebody may have wanted to tar the Connecticut abolitionists with the same tar as the Massachusetts abolitionists. At least that's where I'm going from. That's how I'm looking at it.
Because the pro-slavers were already using the Salem witch trials against Massachusetts, right?
That's correct, yes. A lot of the Massachusetts, some of the literary ones like John Greenleaf Whittier and others, the poets in the literary scene was pretty abolitionist oriented. Not everybody, but a lot of them. But there wasn't really that much coming from Connecticut. And so it was kind of strange, but the thing is that what the Connecticut people did, which was really important, was that they actually worked to free slaves and get that to the U.S. Supreme Court so the whole country could see it. You know what I mean? It was a little bit different, and it really provided impetus not only just to the Connecticut abolitionists, but to actually all the abolitionists, because they could see that they could work through the system. And there was controversy over that. They could work through the system to get these slaves freed. And it was very important to them at this time because they weren't doing so well.
Was this effective, do you think, as propaganda against the abolitionists?
Probably not. But the problem was that here's the bottom line with the pro-Southern strategy. they made these people out like fanatics, right? The abolitionists. I don't think it was terribly persuasive, let's put it that way. But it was something they could use because they wanted to undermine the whole idea of what we would call the early republic. The propaganda, if you will, in the early republic was that the moral, political, and social superiority of the Puritans had been something that should be the model for the future of the United States. See? And the only issue they had was that these people did have this witchcraft business. And so they used that as kind of like an opportunity to get back at them to say, well, you think you're so moral and you're so self-righteous, etc. But you people were religious fanatics. And as far as we're concerned, you're turning, just like you turned white people against white people, meaning the witchcraft situation. Now you're turning white people against white people and fomenting dissent here in the 19th century. So it's very complicated and nuanced in a way. And I didn't set out to do this in that particular way. I'm not a Civil War historian, but it seems to me that somebody took the opportunity and felt that it was an argument that they could use, and they used it.
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at these instances in the 19th century and in those centuries where the trope of the witch, the fear of the witch is used like this. I think it hasn't been looked at and talked about a lot. So I think this is really important because the witch trials and the fear of the witch, the condemnation of the witch, it really weaves itself through the historical heritage of the evolution of the United States and all societies.
It does, and it pops up, particularly in the literary. There's a whole cottage industry in the literary area of the witch theme or the witch motif in America in the 19th century. And of course, it finally reaches its peak with Arthur Miller in The Crucible. That is used in a political way in his play. So it's not something that's died and gone away. Let's put it that way,
I wanted to know if you found their focus on Juliana's supposed examination, and especially the pricking and the search for the witch marks, how reflective of actual witch mark searches is that? Does that portray what the women were going through?
I don't recall much pricking going on here in Connecticut. What I do know is, and we know there was the ducking in the water, there's a lot of that, and the examining for witch marks. Now, they didn't go pricking, as far as I know. They just examined visually, as far as I can tell. There was no mention of pricking anywhere. Now, they could have been doing it, but they didn't say they were. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because a lot of cases, the famous one is the one in Fairfield. I remember in that case, the midwife gave testimony, midwife Odell, and she was the one that gave testimony in court saying that there were witch marks. And later, when she was hanged, it was Mary Staples who went up to her when they cut her down. She started grabbing her body and pushing her around looking for the witch marks. And she goes, "Those don't look like witch marks to me. They look like marks any woman would have." And one of the women that was standing there looked at her and said, "You keep saying that, we're going to find them on you," basically, is what she said. And so we know that they were and did find witch marks on people, and they weren't supposed to use that as a means of convicting somebody. That was just supposed to be a sign, so to speak. You know what I mean? There should have been other proofs of some occult practice that they could prove. But sometimes I think they might have just used the witch marks. But we don't have a record of the trials themselves. You know what I mean? We're only guessing at this point.
Right. Because we know from Salem, there is a description of some searches, and it doesn't mention pricking. It mentions a committee of midwives coming to inspect the body.
Right, exactly.
Basically, where we know in Scotland, there were actually male witch prickers who went around for a living to go and use those devices that you showed, sometimes fake ones, and they would go and prick until they found something that didn't bleed. Basically, yeah.
That's right.
It was awful.
Did they prick George Jacob Sr.?
they lanced something and it didn't produce any corruption. So
Yeah.
they thought that was a witch mark.
I'll tell you what happened. I was reading this book that came out a little bit before my book. She had interviewed me actually for stuff that I didn't know she was writing a book. And she had come to me and interviewed me for some stuff before I wrote my book. But Connecticut witch trials, the first panic in the New World. So her name was Cynthia Boynton. Anyway, I read it, and it's not an academic book, but it's a good book. It's very short, but it's good. You get the information. But anyway, she mentioned Juliana Cox, and she just said there was a story about this Juliana Cox and blah, 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 and that was it. She didn't know anything more about it. And it bothered me. And so for the last, I'm going to say 3 or 4 years more, no, 5 or 6 years, I started doing this, searching around for this, and it took me a long time. And I finally discovered that it came from that English Grenville book I talked about. But what I didn't know, because I've never really studied the abolitionists, I really haven't. And I was reading this book by this woman called The Spectre of Salem, and she writes about what happened with the Salem witch trials and the effect it had on the beginning of the Civil War and the abolitionists. And when I read this, it all of a sudden dawned on me, and I said, this is the same darn thing, but she didn't write about it because nobody knew about it. They didn't know where it came from, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's how I finally figured it out, I guess, as best I can say, and at least until someone else comes along with a better story. It's the way I like it. But I documented it, and I documented that newspaper and where the story first appeared, and the fact that it never appeared in the 1823 Hartford Times or the years surrounding that, you know? So I figure, well, I got something that's interesting if the people that are interested in this kind of stuff.
Yeah. I want to say I've heard this kind of story about a hunter shooting an animal or grabbing an animal and it turns into a woman who's a witch. I've heard this. We talked to a man named Scott Ferrara probably 3 years ago now.
Mhm.
And he wrote a book about people accused of witchcraft in New York. And in there, he includes a story. It's like an urban legend about this Auntie Greenleaf character. And a hunter went out because there was a mysterious all-white deer in the woods, and livestock were dying whenever somebody would see this thing. So he went out to hunt it. He didn't find the animal where he expected to find it, but tracked the blood to a woman's cottage. And so he declared her to be the witch. So I've just heard this. It's like a familiar, people must have heard this original Juliana Cox story or some story like it and just run with it.
Yeah, I think my understanding is it's quite common in that area of England where this story comes from. It's not unusual, let's put it that way. I've actually heard this in other instances too myself, but for me, what the difference was here was I actually had almost the exact same story to open it up. You know what I mean? It's not like you have to really search hard to say, hey, wait a minute, this sounds like they just took this story and finagled it a little bit and said, let's use this.
The only thing they changed was the hare to a fox.
Fox, yeah. Right.
Every other word of it's about verbatim
much
copied. Yeah.
The thing about it that's interesting too is that as you read the story, they actually talk about the selectmen in Glastonbury and they name them. And they say these 3 men gave evidence of this, this, and this. And so the whole thing is set up like it's a real report, you know, and that's probably why it got spread around in all those newspapers, because it was, I'm telling you, if you go in and look in some of these old newspapers, if you can find them online and look up Juliana Cox, you'll see the story appears all over the place, the Midwest, Oklahoma, and it goes on and then it dies out, it seems to me, after the 1880s when people start asking questions and then it just disappears. And then the real documents start appearing and people get the thing I've told you about before is that even with Taylor's book, right, on the witchcraft delusion in Connecticut, people still do not know that there were witch trials in Connecticut. Every time I go to give a talk, people either come up to me or they just go, I never knew that. I'm going like, what do you mean? You should know by now. We've been talking about this for 10 years or something. But it's when I don't say that, of course, but it's amazing how many people do not know. They know about Salem, but they don't know about the witches in Connecticut, let's put it that way. So it's funny, but maybe sad is probably a better word.
This was really great. Dr. Ross, do you have any more comments?
I think one of the things that's important is, and I can't get into it this much, but is to understand how important the Puritan model was to the early republic and why this was the witchcraft business, the Salem witchcraft business was devastating in a way. I don't know how many people are convinced, but it was in a way devastating for them to use that as a cudgel against the people that were trying to talk about how wonderful the Puritans were. I will tell you one thing that I read, which was interesting, was that following the Civil War, the emphasis moved from the Puritans to the Pilgrims. And so there was like a little bit of a reconciliation, I guess you might say. Mm-hmm. And so the focus became on Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims and the idea of people coming together and breaking bread together, all that, Thanksgiving, as opposed to focusing on the founding of the country on the basis of Puritan views and ideals.
Yeah.
Right.
Then my next interest is going to be on talking with the dead, I think. That's going to be...
Oh.
That's something I'm interested in now. And there's been books written on it, but it's all part of the 19th century. And there, by the way, there's abolitionists involved in that too.
Yeah.
I did do something on possession at that time period. And there's a few other people, I think, working on this too right now. But Ann Cole in some of that. That's the kind of thing, you know, I just keep up a little bit and I'm interested in that anyway.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Well, thank you for all the research that you do and how you synthesize it and the books that you have published. And we really appreciate you coming on the podcast to talk to us. And we look forward to your next project. Today, Dr. Ross mentioned the Salem witch trials. And if you want to learn more about that history, check out our YouTube course, The Salem Witch Trials Daily.
You can pick up Dr. Ross's books in our bookshop online at bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhunts. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.